There we go. All right. Good evening, everyone that's tuned into this webinar. This is our Module 3 public meeting for the Zoning Code Revision Project. We've got our consultants here with the White & Smith Planning and Law Group, Tyson Smith and Kelly Cousineau, to give us a presentation and also to answer any questions you might have. A little bit of housekeeping when we get to the question and answer portion of it. For those that have tuned in to Zoom, you'll notice you have a raise hand button on your screen, depending on the platform you're using. When we come time to ask questions, if you'll click that button, we'll be able to identify you and get your mic working so we can take your questions. If you're calling on the phone, it's *9 is the function to raise your hand to show that you'd like to speak. So either raise hand on the Zoom platform or *9 on your phone if you've called in. I also want to remind everybody that's either new to this process or just becoming familiar, we do have a landing site on our web page under Planning Development Services. That's where we've got all the documents that have been discussed from day one of this project all the way back to the kickoff from spring 2019. So all that information is there, as well as recordings of presentations we made at City Council, as well as our last module meeting. We've got a copy of the Zoom webinar from that meeting. So if anybody wants to go back and watch previous recordings, those are up and available to you. So with that said, I'll pass it on to Tyson to kick us off.
Thanks, Andrew. Good evening, everyone. My name is Tyson Smith. I'm with the firm of White & Smith. We're the planning firm that was hired to start this zoning ordinance rewrite back in 2019. Kelly Cousineau is also with us tonight from our office here in Charleston, South Carolina. As Andrew said, we're going to go over the third phase or module of this writing effort. I appreciate you all hanging there with us over this period of time, and we will get started here. I'm going to share my screen, and we'll first just go over, as a reminder, what we have done to get to this point. And then Kelly, who drafted primarily Module 3, will go over the specific changes in Module 3. And then we'll talk about what you can expect from here to the end of the project. Some of you were involved back in 2019 in June. We had a series of two-day series of kickoff meetings. We met with various stakeholders and with the public, Planning and Zoning Commission, as well as the City Council, to kick the project off. We were back in Amarillo in September of last year to present an assessment that we prepared following those meetings in June. The assessment was our articulation of what we heard from the community in terms of what needed to be looked at. In some cases, what needed to be changed, but in most cases, just these are areas of the code that haven't worked as well or that could be looked at to bring us more into the modern context or the current context. So after that, we started drafting, and we finished the first module in the early part of this year and brought that to you in February in our meetings there in Amarillo. And then we completed the second draft or second phase, Module 2, and we brought that to you by Zoom meeting in June. So that brings us to our Module 3. This is the work plan you'll all probably remember, or many of you will. This is what we've been looking at since day one. We are now at this point down here in 3.3, the drafting phase of the project. And we'll go over that a little bit more at the end of the conversation, as I said earlier, to go over what you can expect from here to the end of the project. In Module 1, the primary focus in Module 1 was, as you might expect, the zoning districts and use table and use regulations in the zoning ordinance. This obviously provides sort of the base of the zoning code itself. And then in Module 2, we started building on that. So having dealt with the zoning districts and any changes there, we start to address things like parking standards, landscaping standards, walls and fences, historic preservation overlay districts, that sort of thing in Module 2. Wrapping up most of the quote unquote substantive areas of the zoning code, and then getting to Module 3, which is what we're going to spend most of our time on tonight, really just dealing with administration and procedures. But we'll also touch on BYOB venues, an area that is a land use that has come into the forefront in Amarillo, but which the zoning code hasn't adequately addressed or clearly addressed. So we've added provisions there to clarify what the rules are that apply to BYOBs, and then also a few changes in the airport overlay district. And then finally, you'll see at the bottom of that box to the right, as to module 3, non-conforming uses. So it's important that we talk about and discuss how we transition from the current code to the new code. There are existing uses in place now. There's nothing in the code that requires anybody to go change anything that's inconsistent with the new code. But it is important that once the new code is adopted, that over time, as people make changes, when those changes occur, they're consistent with the new code. And I will say, when we get to that point of proceeding that discussion that Kelly's going to run, that we've been cognizant of the fact that we don't want to create a lot of nonconformities. We want to be friendly to the property owner while also balancing that against the need to implement a new code, because this one's been around since the late 60s. Okay, with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kelly. And while she's switching over to her screen share, if anybody has any questions for me so far, feel free to jump in. Is that okay with you, Andrew? Or would you rather just hold questions to the end?
No, I think that's fine. Just a reminder to hit your raise hand button or *9 on your phone if you'd like to ask a question.
Okay, Kelly, why don't you go ahead?
Don't see any.
Okay, excellent. Good evening, everybody. As Andrew mentioned, all of the project documents are on the city's website at this location. We've got all of the documents associated with Module 3 that you can review, as well as the earlier modules. Module 3, as Tyson mentioned, mainly addresses procedures and administrative requirements, and that covers Articles 5 through 11 of the zoning ordinance. The first 6 items on this list fall within those articles that were on the previous slide. And then we have these 2 special topics that we've been working on, Byob Venues and Events, as well as the Airport Overlay District. So we'll talk about each of these 8 topics in a little bit more detail, starting with the Consolidated Procedures. So this Article 5 consolidates all of the zoning related procedures and requirements. For the most part, carries forward existing requirements, but there were some places where we needed to clarify or augment those existing procedures. The first sort of section of this article establishes general rules that apply to all or most procedures, like pre-application conferences and notice requirements. And then the bulk of the article are descriptions of the process for each specific land use decision, each application, so site plans, rezonings, variances, etc. And each of those specific procedures generally shares a common workflow that's shown in this list on the right. So each procedure will have a purpose, tells you why the process exists, when it applies, who and how to initiate an application, how you know when your application is complete, what public notice is required, if any, and then it provides a very specific detail of the approval process. So it lays out each type of meeting and review body that looks at the application and who ultimately makes the final decision on the application. And the next section lists approval criteria. So you'll know exactly what criteria have to be met in order for an application to be approved. Then there's a description of the procedure for reapplication. If you have a withdrawn or denied application, sometimes there's a waiting period, so that would be addressed here. There's a section that tells you how an applicant can appeal a decision that they don't agree with. The scope of approval tells you what approval of the particular application allows, essentially what's the next step in the process. And then some procedures like specific use permits have specific record keeping requirements. And then so those are included here as well. There is one new procedure that was added for comprehensive plan amendments. This allows a property owner to request an amendment to the comprehensive plan, future land use and character map for their property. These applications must be submitted concurrently with a rezoning application, and of course the requested zoning should be consistent with the requested future land use designation. Since this is a new procedure, we have added a fee for this, and it is the same as the rezoning application fees, which were $800, but I understand might have increased a little bit in the next budget year. We've also consolidated all of the submittal requirements into one place. This is Article 11, the last article in the zoning ordinance. This article sets forth requirements for traffic impact analyses, and as well as giving review and approval or review and decision-making bodies the ability to request technical reports and studies. We'll talk about both of those items in a little bit more detail. This article also has an application checklist matrix, which is what's shown here on the screen. So you can take a look at this and see exactly what is required to make a complete application for any of the types of applications that are in the procedures article. I will note that the matrix that's online right now includes all of the procedures that are in Article 5, but the final version of the zoning ordinance, this matrix will just include those application requirements associated with applications that go to boards or commissions, any staff level approvals, staff applications that are approved at staff level will have checklists maintained outside the ordinance so staff can adjust those as needed. This article also establishes fees or carries forward the current fees. There's only been one change in the fees, and that's to the Historic Preservation Overlay District. The current fee is $375, but it's really a special type of rezoning, and so the fees should be the same as a rezoning application. So that has changed to match the rezoning fees. Okay, so traffic impact analysis. This is a new submittal requirement that implements two comprehensive plan strategies from the mobility chapter and the growth management chapter. These will be required for three types of applications: specific use permits, rezonings to a planned district, and then site plans. The threshold with these is 100 peak hour vehicle trips. So if a proposed development is anticipated to generate less than 100 peak hour vehicle trips, a level 1 TIA is required, which we're calling a trip generation memo. And this is primarily for information purposes for the review and decision-making bodies, just provide some general information about the proposed development and the anticipated trip generation resulting from the development. And it may help to identify some unique site characteristics or development characteristics that may warrant a more detailed traffic impact analysis. But generally, the level 1 TIA is just a fairly simple memorandum of describing the current or the proposed development and expected trips. So proposed developments that generate or are anticipated to generate 100 or more peak hour vehicle trips have to do a higher level analysis, what we're calling a level 2 TIA or a traffic impact study. You can see in the chart on the right some examples of building sizes and number of units that might hit that 100 peak hour trips threshold. And these are just estimates based on the 10th edition of the ITE trip generation manual. And I should clarify, when we say peak hour is measured using either the peak hour of the street that's adjacent to the development or the peak hour for the traffic generating land use, whichever results in more trips. And this is particularly relevant for things, churches are a good example. They have a lot of traffic on Sundays, but not during weekday rush hours. So this allows you to take a better look at the impacts of the proposed development. So this level 2 TIA is also intended as information for review and decision-making bodies, but as I mentioned, it's a higher level analysis. It's a quantitative assessment of the nature and extent of the proposed development's impact on the transportation network. And one major component of a level 2 TIA is a mitigation plan. So that would identify transportation improvements and their associated costs that would offset the proposed development's impact on the transportation network. Typically, this would be the developer's responsibility to install those improvements to mitigate any impacts from the proposed development. There are provisions we're working with staff on some provisions for public facilities agreements that could open up some opportunities to work with the city on proposed transportation improvements. So most of the procedures in Article 5 are designed for the average, the typical cases that the city sees, typical variances, rezonings, that sort of thing. Sometimes there are applications that are more complex due to the nature or the location of the development, and where the review and decision-making bodies feel like they need more information about a particular aspect of the development in order to give it full consideration. So this allowance in the zoning ordinance would allow review and decision-making bodies to require applicants to submit technical reports and studies for 4 different types of applications: rezonings to a planned district, specific use permits, certificates of appropriateness, and variances. Depending on the type of application, this could include any of the studies that are listed here. The expert real estate evaluation is currently a requirement for all SUP applications and continues to be a requirement. This would allow the review and decision-making bodies to potentially request that for another type of application if they feel that it's needed in order to fully evaluate the proposed application. Okay, going into nonconformities. The revised zoning ordinance reflects the community's current goals and policies. So if existing development no longer conforms to those desired development patterns, it's in the community's interest to bring the uses and structures into compliance over a reasonable period of time when the property owner proposes changes to the property. The city's current regulations address non-conforming uses and non-conforming lots. The proposed regulations also address non-conforming structures as well as non-conforming site improvements, such as landscaping or parking. There are 2 major changes proposed to the current regulations, as well as 2 additions that we'll talk about on the next slide. First, the abandonment period for non-conforming uses is reduced from 1 year to 6 months. This reduces the length of time a non-conforming use can be discontinued without having to comply with new code provisions. Under the current code, a property's non-conforming use can be reestablished as long as it isn't discontinued for more than a year. So under the revised code, this would be a 6-month period of discontinuance would require compliance with the new code upon the property's use being reestablished. The second major change in this section is the threshold at which a damaged non-conforming structure located in the airport overlay district must be replaced. It's reduced from 60% to 50% of structural value. The 50% standard is already the current threshold for damaged non-conforming structures located outside the overlay district, the airport overlay district. So this revision creates consistency with throughout the city. The 2 additions I mentioned, the first is an automatic 10% building setback reduction for non-conforming lots to encourage infill development and redevelopment. So I mentioned this article also adds provisions for non-conforming site improvements. The proposed regulations require a property owner to bring non-conforming site improvements into compliance with current requirements when alterations to a building are proposed that increase floor area or for restaurant use, usable seating area by more than 3,000 square feet or 35% of gross floor area, whichever is less, or when the number of off-street parking spaces increases by more than 35%. This provides flexibility for redevelopment while balancing the need to bring nonconformities into compliance with current regulations over a reasonable period of time. Next, I'll talk about BYOB events and venues, which is an emerging land use that the current zoning ordinance doesn't address well. We're proposing two distinct uses. The first is BYOB events, which are temporary uses that would be subject to, excuse me, all temporary use regulations that you all saw in Article 3, which was part of Module 1. BYOB events are limited to one event per year per site. They're allowed in central business district, light commercial, heavy commercial, and both of the industrial districts. Event hours are limited to 7 a.m. to 2 a.m. and a staff level site plan approval is required. If the event is going to be open to the general public, it also requires approval by the city's environmental health department, consistent with their current process for reviewing and approving special events. Then we have BYOB venues, which is a principal use. So essentially any location that has more than one BYOB event per year is considered a BYOB venue, which requires a specific use permit. The use is allowed in the same districts as BYOB events, and these are also the same districts where bars are allowed. So for BYOB venues, the SUP is valid for 1 year. This approval can be renewed through a staff level approval if the renewal request is made at least 45 days prior to expiration. The venue continues to meet all of the applicable zoning regulations, and if as long as there aren't any pending enforcement actions or violations with regard to the venue. Consistent with state alcohol laws, venues must close every day from 2 a.m. to 7 a.m. As part of the SUP application, an applicant has to submit a public safety plan that at a minimum addresses on-site security and fire safety. In addition, all BYOB venues have to comply with all of the use regulations that apply to event venues. Again, that was something that y'all may remember from Module 1. That includes submittal of an operational plan, as well as maintenance of an on-site manager. So whenever the BYOB venue is open, there should be a manager on site that's making sure that all of the city's regulations are complied with. And the last topic I'll go over is the Airport Overlay District. This is a new zoning district that carries forward and updates the city's current airport zoning regulations, which are codified in Chapter 409 of the City Code. This is the only part of the zoning ordinance that applies outside the city limits, well, inside the city limits and outside the city limits in the ETJ. We've updated the GIS layers for this so that the Airport Overlay District can be shown on the zoning map. This map represents the outermost boundary of the Airport Overlay District here in blue, and you can see the city boundaries are here in red. And actually a couple, I think these two sides of the overlay district actually go beyond the ETJ. So within the Airport Overlay District, there are 3 zones. 2, the height hazard zones and the noise zones are current regulations, which we're carrying forward and updating. And then the 3rd zone is new. It is a wildlife hazard zone that is a 5-mile radius around the airport boundary, which is consistent with Federal Aviation Administration guidance. This zone was implemented to address concerns expressed by airport staff. The zone limits land uses that could attract wildlife, particularly birds, that can create a hazard to pilots. A good example is landfills. So the regulations don't necessarily prohibit these type of land uses from locating within the Airport Overlay District, but it does trigger a review by airport staff so they can make a determination regarding whether the land use could potentially create an airport hazard. The height hazard zone, as I mentioned, is a current zone. We've updated it for consistency with current airport approaches and surfaces. So it includes all of the land and air within the approach, departure, and other imaginary surfaces associated with the airport. In this zone, height is limited. There are different zones within this height hazard zone, and those are established in the airport master plan. Generally, though, any structure or tree that is less than 50 feet is not restricted from locating here. It's really once you get above 50 feet that there is the potential for structures or trees to penetrate these airport surfaces and potentially become a hazard. The final zone are the noise zones. Again, these are current. They've been updated for consistency with the noise contours established in the most recently approved airport master plan. And in these areas, noise sensitive land uses are limited, such as residential uses, schools, those sort of things that don't mix well with aircraft noise. And from there, I will ask if there's any questions before I turn it back to Tyson.
Just a reminder to hit *9 if you've called in, or to click the raise hand button on your Zoom application if you'd like to speak. Not seeing any. Oh, hold on, I do see one. Just a second. Okay, Fred, looks like you're muted. There you go. You should be able to talk now. Okay.
Andrew, is anything coming through on your end?
No, I'm not hearing him. Showing him unmuted though, and able to talk. Just raise his hand again. Let's see. Right, you tried talking? Let me move in the panelists, see if that helps. Try unmuting yourself now, Fred. Seems like we're having some audio issues.
Yeah, I see him here. He's unmuted.
Yeah, it looks like he's trying. You might check your settings on audio, Fred, on the bottom left with that phone icon to make sure your microphone's set to your device or whichever one you called in on. Doesn't seem to be working. Maybe go ahead and we'll see if it works here in a little bit.
Okay. No, I don't see any other hands raised right now. You want me to wrap up the procedural things, and that'll give Fred a second, and anybody else
Sure,
who wants another second to think about it?
sure.
We've covered a lot of material. Okay, well, I will just walk us through the final steps of the process. This is our project we've been following along on, and as you can see, after this, we'll basically be heading into last 3 elements of the project, and then taking the consolidated version of the zoning ordinance to the Planning and Zoning Commission for its input, and then final action by the City Council after public hearings. So this would be where we merge all 3 modules together so that it can be reviewed as a full document. And we're hoping that done around the first week in November. It will depend in part on how quickly we can get some revisions made based on prior comments. And then the only thing I want to point out here, I mentioned we've covered a lot of material. We realize that, and we realize it's a lot to take in. So I just reiterate 2 things that Kelly pointed out at the beginning here, and that these are available for every module: review, an overview, and also a tracking. And this tracking document is pretty detailed. It looks like this. It's going to have the old section numbers or the current section numbers and titles, and then it's going to indicate where that has been moved or revised. So you'll have the new section numbers and titles here, and then a brief description here of what we've changed. If anything, you'll see a number of things that have just simply been carried forward. That means we didn't make any change. You'll see some things where we didn't make a change, but we just moved it. And then you'll see some things we've changed entirely. So that will lead you or direct you in that area if that's one that interests you, that you want to follow up more on. If you have any comments after tonight, feel free to send them to Chris Valverde. He's in the planning department, but here's his contact information as well. And he'll make sure we get any comments. I'm sure if they make their way to Andrew, he'll also make sure we get them as well too. So we're hoping that we're going to wrap up around the end of the year. If not the end of the year, then the very beginning of next year. But like I said, we'll be getting a final draft to the staff within the next 2 or 3 weeks, and then after its final review, posted on the website and get our final meeting scheduled. So again, we're happy to take questions about the process or the Module 3 changes.
I've got one. So you should be able to talk now.
Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
And my questions about the traffic impact analysis studies that are going to be required. How are those going to be incorporated with projects that already have vested rights?
If a project has vested rights that are still active, this requirement wouldn't apply. This would apply to new SUPs and rezonings and is it special use?
Yeah, specific use permits and I think site permits for new development.
Site plan permits, right? So it'll be for new development.
Okay.
Anybody else have questions? Not seeing any more. Okay.
Maybe Fred can give you a
And then-
call.
Right. So, and just a reminder, we'll save this video to put on our website as well. And throughout the rest of the process, that's where we make all our announcements. We'll also be putting out posts on social media, press releases, just to let everybody know what the timeline, what the process is. So keep a lookout for that. And then if you review those documents, have any questions, definitely feel free to reach out to me or Chris, and we will respond to you as soon as we can. But I guess that's all for tonight. Appreciate everybody tuning in.
Thank you all. Good night.
Thank you.
Thanks.